to heathen lands, their distance, their barbarism, the danger that would be encountered, the difficulties of support, and the unintelligible languages. Carey argued that these same obstacles did not prevent merchants from going to distant shores. Carey wrote, "It only requires that we should have as much love to the souls of our fellow creatures, fellow sinners, as they have for the profits arising from a few otter skins, and all these difficulties could be easily surmounted. By encouraging others to break free from the restrictive theology of their time, the Great Commission was once again given preeminence, and the Baptist Missionary Society was then formed." Carey and his family went to India. The British East India Company was exercising its full power at the time and refused Carey permission to live in Calcutta. Its only interest being profits, its representatives in India considered the sending out of missionaries into our eastern possessions to be the maddest and most extravagant, most costly, most indefensible project which has ever been suggested by a moonstruck fanatic. Such a scheme of pernicious, imprudent, useless, harmful, dangerous, profitless, fantastic. Carey settled in Serampore, found a job as foreman in an indigo factory in Bengal, and began an intensive study of the original languages. In 1799, two fellow Baptists joined Carey, and for the next 25 years, the three men worked together to organize a growing network of mission stations in and beyond Bengal. Just a side note here, if you want to read a really interesting biography, you should read his biography. Everything's left out in what we're just going over here, because there was so much detail and he met so much opposition, he met so much crisis, but he pressed on, and he really, really did a great work for God. But anyway, I just thought I'd mention that. These three gentlemen diligently studied Hindu thought and culture. They regarded a full understanding of Hindu thought as an essential part of their equipment, not only because the preacher of the gospel cannot be clearly understood if he speaks merely out of self-confidence of his own knowledge, but also because they understood that it was not only the souls and bodies of men that needed to be redeemed. The thought of a non-Christian nation is also one of those realms that are to be taken captive and brought into subjection to Jesus Christ. The example of these men became contagious. A new and a pervasive determination in Protestantism arose to carry the gospel to all men. The earlier prevailing attitude of the major churches had considered missions an unnecessary and hopeless undertaking. Now voices on all sides were proclaiming the duty of all Christians to share in the conversion of peoples of the whole world. The gospel was not the private possession of European peoples. One of the reasons that there was such a struggle initially with Carey getting missions even to be considered by the ordinary person, or especially by the authorities in the Baptist church or in the church as a whole, was because Calvinism was still really strong. Like I said, there's a resurgence of Calvinism now, but at that time, this wasn't that long after the Reformation, a few hundred years, and Calvinism and Lutheranism were both very, very strong. And the Calvinist concept is that people that are going to be saved are going to be saved. And people that aren't, and so what's the point? You know what I mean? Those are heathens over there. They're probably not supposed to be saved, and if they are, God will find a way. And that was the attitude. And even today, in some of the more strict Calvinist, I would say, circles, there's still, that belief still exists. Now, on the other hand, you have in some of your Calvinist Reformed groups, they're very, very evangelistic, very, very missions-oriented. They believe almost just the opposite. They believe that there are those in, quote, heathen nations or countries who are destined to be the elect, and we've got to go over there and we've got to reach them for God, So you have both contrasts. But CF and I had asked me one time to do a series on Calvinism, and so I did. And it was because there were a few students who came from Reformed churches, and I don't know if they recruited or what, but anyway, before they knew it on that semester when on that particular semester, there were Calvinists witnessing all over the campus, trying to convert the students to the Reformed doctrine. And it became almost a campus fight, because some of the students, tried to combat their doctrine. And the Calvinists were very, very overbearing and very condemning, and even of CF&I, even though there were students there. Anyway, it became such an issue there, and it was causing such a controversy on campus. This was probably about 5 years ago. That they asked me to do a series. So I did a series on Calvinism. And I discovered in my research and study that I don't think this exists today, but earlier in the 20th century, 1900s, it existed up until that time, that there were so many strong statements made by Catholics, by Calvinist leaders. Hateful statements about, those who aren't the elect deserve to burn in hell. They're the offspring of Satan, and just things like, I couldn't believe what I was hearing from and reading from men of God who would preach the gospel on Sunday and then turn around and say that, basically with no attitude. And also another thing that was more common than you would imagine was some Calvinists who were very, very dogmatic believed that that as far as the elect goes, who's going to be saved and who's not going to be saved, they basically believed that that thought slipped from my mind. Hopefully it'll come back. Hopefully it'll come back. Y'all have to forgive me for this. I don't know what's going on with me. Let's see. Well, I'm trying to think. I'd like to tell you what I was going to tell you. Let's just go back to our subject here. Maybe I'll think of it in a minute. I think we're probably at point A here. Literally hundreds of missionaries enlisted to carry the gospel to the nations. Many are long forgotten because they died within a matter of months in some malaria-infested tropical climate or at the hands of some savage tribe. In large part, the passion to preach the gospel to the heathen sprang from the 18th century evangelical revivals in England and America. Evangelical awakenings revolutionized preaching and its objectives. Traditional churchmen limited the minister's task of nurturing the seed of faith planted at baptism in members of the parish. These men could not imagine preaching the gospel in a tribal society. At the same time, Christians who held a rigid doctrine of predestination saw no need to concern themselves with the elect in India or China. Evangelicals, however, saw preaching as calling sinners to God through faith in Christ. They felt a personal responsibility to do this and saw no difference between baptized heathen in Britain and non-Christian people overseas. In the 1820s and 30s, the idea of Britain as a Christian nation with Christian responsibilities overseas took root. Interest in overseas missions became a general feature of British church life. Two emphases led to this new Protestant world vision. One was evangelical, and the Bible teaches that men are lost without faith in Christ, and the Lord commands believers in every age to make salvation known to all the world. The second was prophetic. Many Christians in the 19th century followed Jonathan Edwards in the belief that the knowledge of the Lord would fill the earth as the waters cover the sea, and this spread of the gospel was preparation for the coming reign of Christ upon the earth. This belief in in the future reign of Christ was called the millennialism. The dedication of the missionary movement blended with the optimism of the age of progress. To make achievement of the goal seemed quite possible. The student volunteer movement of foreign missions watchword was the evangelization of the world in its generation. And we have David Livingstone, who's a great figure and a great character in the history of the church, especially in Africa and missions. At the age of 19, David Livingstone, the great explorer of the Dark Continent, determined to devote his life to the alleviation of human misery. He studied as a doctor to prepare for work as a missionary, and then went to South Africa to help Robert Moffat in 1841. Never staying in one place long, he felt drawn by the smoke of 1,000 villages and had never seen a missionary. While traveling the continent, he demonstrated all the qualities of a great explorer. He was always patient with those he encountered. He never used force or violence, and his scientific and geographical observations were minutely accurate. Livingstone's cause was the gospel. He wrote, "I place no value on anything I have or may possess, except in relation to the kingdom of Christ." Greatly moved by the devastating slave trade of Central Africa, Livingstone worked diligently to resolve the situation. He realized that the slave trade could not continue without the Africans' own participation in it. The temptation was always present to raid weaker neighboring tribes in order to capture slaves. Only if the Africans could be persuaded to exchange the products of their own fields and forests for those things the white men could supply would end this terrible practice. The traditional denominations of the day used one of three forms of church government: Episcopal, Presbyterian, or Congregational. Supporters of each claimed to be following the Bible, and blood had been shed to defend their arguments. As conviction of the responsibility to spread the gospel worldwide began to draw on British and American Christians, it became clear that none of the traditional forms of church government would enable the church to embark on world missions. Supporters of global evangelism were driven to find another form of cooperation, the voluntary society. Carey again proved to be the pioneer. He proposed the formation of a company of serious-minded Christians, laymen, and ministers. This group should have a committee to collect and shift information, and to find funds and suitable missionaries to send to foreign lands. The voluntary society transformed 19th century Christianity. It was invented to meet a need rather than for theological reasons. But in effect, it determined the established forms of church government. Anglican, Baptist, Congregationalists, and Methodists could now work together for defined purposes without raising questions about church structure. The power base in the church was altered by encouraging lay leadership. Ordinary Christian men and later women came to hold key positions in the important societies, something thought impossible elsewhere in the church. The London Missionary Society in 1795, its fundamental principle that our design is not to send Presbyterianism, independency, episcopacy, or any other form of church government, but the glorious gospel of the blessed God to the heathen. One of the founders called for the funeral of bigotry. Thanks to the formation of missionary societies, the person who collected a penny a week from members of his local missionary society and distributed the missionary magazine participated fully in the work of missions. In the United States, the first foreign missionary society was the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions in 1810. It was formed on the initiative of a group of students at the newly created Congregational Andover Theological Seminary. These students laid the foundation for a missionary advance by Americans. Shortly thereafter, Baptists, Presbyterians, and other major denominations created their own missionary societies. Conversion of the heathen became one of the major concerns of local congregations in every city and town in the country. By the end of the 19th century, almost every Christian body had its share in the missionary enterprise overseas. Many times, these early missionaries were unaware of the conflicts the gospel produced in other cultures. To most of them, Christianity in its Western form was true Christianity. To make an Indian or a Malaysian a Christian was to turn him into a Dutchman or a Portuguese. Unfortunately, even today, Christians combine much that is cultural tradition with the faith. This problem has pursued all missionary work from the beginning. In Christianity, if Christianity appears in Western habits that other people find shocking, such as eating meat or a greater familiarity between sexes than is permitted in most Eastern societies, then the faith is condemned before it is even examined. However, there is a distinctiveness in the Christian community that arises from the distinctiveness of the gospel itself. The gospel is a revolutionary power, and any attempt to disguise that fact is likely to change Christian faith into something else. The depth of this problem helps explain why Christianity in regions dominated by ancient cultures, Islamic, Hindu, and Chinese, is still very much a minority. In spite of all barriers, the Protestant missionary movement continued to expand. In the process, it highlighted several characteristics of modern Christianity. Worldwide expansion came by voluntarism rather than by compulsion. Since the time of Constantine, propagation of the faith had come by active support of rulers in Christian countries and mass conversions. Protestant missionaries had no state support or control and advanced only by the power of persuasion. Therefore, Christians found a way to engage in missions while upholding religious freedom. The missionary movement tapped the wealth and talents of all Protestants, as opposed to previous missionary endeavors led by monks and bishops. Missionary societies were organized on the widest base possible, so the primary task of the churches to preach the gospel fell upon the people of the churches. Many humanitarian ministries accompanied the widespread preaching of the gospel. Mission agencies established schools, hospitals, and centers for training doctors and nurses. They translated the Bible and other Western writings into many languages and dialects and introduced public health measures and better agricultural techniques. While closely related to the goal of conversion, these things sprang out of recognition of social and physical needs of the people that no Christian could ignore. In many respects, the missionary movement restored the gospel to its central place in Christianity. It also restored an element in the concept of the Holy Catholic Church that the Reformation had obscured as it reached out to embrace new peoples in many new lands. In 1835, Lyman Beecher, Presbyterian and Congregational minister in New England, preached a sermon called A Plea for the West. He firmly believed a vast new empire was opening in the American wilderness and felt an entire culture was at stake. Christians should seize the opportunity, he said, and shape the religious and political destiny of the nation. He called for preaching the gospel, distributing Bibles, planting churches, establishing schools, and reforming American morals. He knew that a free society needed just laws, and in democracy, just laws required popular support informed by Christianity. Historians speak of this era as the age of the righteous empire. The vision for a Christian America is a dominant theme in the 19th century American Protestantism. Without some knowledge of this century, today's Christians find it almost impossible to understand the social forces and religious figures of their own times. The challenge of the American West. The evangelical dream for America was an expression of Christian concern for society. The American West provided evangelical Christianity with its greatest opportunity ever to press the claims of the gospel upon a whole nation. Though this vision has faded with time, its basic impulse remains because it is part of the Lord's purpose for His people. How can Christians not be concerned for the world around them? After the Revolutionary War, Americans began to pour into the Western territory. Between 1792 and 1821, 9 new states were added to the original 13. By mid-century, half of the American people were west of the Appalachians. The rough task of fighting Indians and subduing the wilderness caused the frontiersmen to have a reputation for wild and lawless living. Barbarian manners shocked the occasional European who traveled past the mountains. Denominations were not prepared to face the opportunities of the West. Christian influence was at an all-time low, and only 5 to 10% of Americans were church members. However, evangelical Christianity eventually tamed the crude, turbulent, and godless society of the West. Evangelicals faced the challenge of winning a nation with the two instruments of the voluntary society and the revival. The voluntary society allowed Christians from various denominations to unite in a matter of common concern. These societies exerted influence upon the public opinion, provided support for far-reaching missionary and educational activities, and spread reform ideals throughout the young nation. In 1790, evangelicals faced the challenges of regaining the East and winning the West for Christ. The Second Great Awakening in the East served to provide skilled and dedicated leaders for the Western Crusade. The traveling frontier preachers became the primary channels for the spread of Christianity. James McGready first ignited a revival in North Carolina that drove scores of people to conversion. Then, traveling to Kentucky, he conducted a revival at Red River. Lawless backwoodsmen responded enthusiastically to his call to repent and be converted. Encouraged, McGready sent out advance notice of the next meeting to be held at Gasper River Church. This meeting, held July 1800, changed the course of American history. Scores of pioneers headed for Gasper River in wagons, on horseback and on foot, in order to stay a while to see, hear, and feel the hand of God. This was the first camp meeting and became a pattern many after would follow. Not all favored the revivals. Many Lutherans and Presbyterians felt they slighted sound doctrine. Roman Catholics and Episcopalians considered them emotional eruptions and not true worship. Criticism was largely ignored as revivalists and missionaries moved west, preaching the gospel, planting churches, and founding colleges. Boy, this is exciting, isn't it? Alexis de Tocqueville stated in 1830 that there is no country in the world in which the Christian religion retains a greater influence over the souls of men. The question arose, how could a democracy infused with Christian principles continue to sanction the enslavement of millions of human beings? The American practice of slavery began on August 20th, 1619, when 20 Negro slaves were unloaded from a Dutch frigate at Jamestown, Virginia. By 1830, their number had increased to approximately 2 million. As the nation spread west and new states came into the Union, the issue of slavery came into question. Should the new territory be slavery-free? Because the struggle was so basic to human existence and so religious in character, both sides turned to the Scriptures to interpret their experiences. The slave turned to the Bible for the meaning of his existence in a new land. His white master had stripped him of everything, including his African gods. In destroying their African culture and breaking up their social organization, slavery deprived Negroes of their sense of a place in the world. Christianity gave the slave a new center for his life. At first, some owners strongly opposed teaching the Scriptures to slaves. They feared the slave might find in the Bible ideas of human equality that could incite rebellion. Others, however, felt the New Testament offered arguments in support of slavery. Some were convinced the best slaves were those who knew the Bible. Reflecting the revival spirit. Crazy, isn't it? Reflecting the revival spirit of the frontier, the Negro preacher was called to his office, nearly always through some experience that indicated God had chosen him as a spiritual leader. There seemed little hope of deliverance from bondage here on earth, so emancipation became linked with death. When Jesus would strike the shackles from the slave and release him into another happier world. The South became increasingly isolated, not only from the North, but the rest of the Western world, where strong judgments against slavery were often expressed. This isolation led to a defensiveness. Harriet Martineau, a visitor to the United States in the 1830s, wrote, "A magic ring seems drawn around those who live amidst slavery, and it gives a circular character to all they think and do upon the subject. There are but few who think within it, who distinctly see anything beyond it." One thing Southerners saw were threats and attacks. Evangelical sentiment against slavery can be traced to the revival preaching of Charles Finney in the North. Many others took up the cause. In her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe appeals, "Christians, every time that you pray that the kingdom of Christ may come, can you forget that prophecy associates in dread fellowship the day of vengeance with the year of his redeemed?" She was referring to the overthrow of evil Babylon predicted in Revelation. The widely held millennialist interpretation felt America was destined to play a key role in the divine plan of God and must be purged of its guilt. Slavery was not a sin of the South alone. It was a national sin that must be cleansed. All sides of the struggle used the same set of symbols. There was one Bible, one heaven, one hell, one Jesus, one path of salvation. How could God be the God of the South against the North and of the North against the South? How could he have sponsored slavery, as Southerners said, and opposed slavery as Northerners contended? Abraham Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, observed, "Both Union and Confederacy read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each involves his aid against the other. The prayers of both could not be answered. The Almighty has his own purposes." The war was fought, blood was shed, and the nation endured, but the vision for a Christian nation was greatly weakened. Black churches rose in great numbers, the primary institutional expression of freedom and the constant reminder of the blind spot in the vision for a Christian America. Shortly after the end of the Civil War, a series of cultural shocks raised questions about the truth and relevance of traditional evangelical beliefs. The first came from Charles Darwin's 1859 book, The Origin of Species. If Darwin was right, how could the Bible be true? The second shock of traditional faith came from the increasing industrialization of American society and the rush to the cities. Immigrants poured into the nation from all around the world, bringing their religious opinions, which were alien to the way traditional Protestant Americans viewed their country and their Bibles. Third, there came a higher criticism of the Bible. These critical views became increasingly dominant in American higher education and eventually in many major denominations. Taken together, these shocks were part of the general shift in Western culture from Christian to secular forms of thought and behavior. Christians disagreed about what actions should be taken to meet the new challenges. Two distinct parties developed among traditionally evangelical denominations. One party chose to embrace the changes as blessings sent from God, which became known as public Protestants. This group spoke of social Christianity, social gospel, social service, and so on. The second party chose to resist the changes as threats to the biblical message and became known as private Protestants, otherwise known as evangelical. They stressed the need for individual salvation. Leaders of the new social outlook distressed over the human damage they saw in the new industrial order. They wanted to see transformation of the world in this life rather than focus on the promises or happiness in the sweet by and by. The private party continued in the traditional revivalism. They crusaded for individual conversions, believing that if a man's heart was right with God, then economic and social problems would take care of themselves. The dream of Christian America was fading fast. Millennialist hopes dissolved in the hatred of the war between the states. The trauma of strikes and financial panics of the 1870s and 80s, and the information of an urban world with its rejection of Christian values. Increasing numbers of evangelicals speculated about the future and turned to cultivation of the inner life. The change of American character in the 50 years between the Civil War and World War I is demonstrated in two statements. One